The wind howled like a wounded creature across the white plains of Ash Hollow, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow and pine. The storm had come early that year, fierce, biting, relentless. Most ranchers had long since barred their doors and banked their fires, but Eli Grant was still out on the ridge, guiding his horse, Rust, through knee-deep drifts. He had spent the day in town picking up supplies, and now the snow had turned what should have been a 2-hour ride into a frozen march. Eli wasn't a man who feared storms. He had seen worse, the kind that tore down fences and flooded valleys. But since his wife's death 3 years ago, he'd come to see every storm as a kind of mirror, cold, violent, and lonely. He rarely spoke to anyone beyond the general storekeeper and his aging housekeeper, Martha. His world had become a quiet circle of chores, silence, and ghosts. As he reached the old wooden bridge near Coyote Creek, Rust halted suddenly, snorting and pawing the snow. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, peering through the white curtain. That's when he saw it. A small, dark shape huddled beneath the broken rail of the bridge, barely visible against the storm. At first he thought it might be an animal, but then it moved. He dismounted quickly, crunching through the snow until he was close enough to see her. A young woman, maybe 20, wrapped in a thin shawl, her hair tangled with ice. Her lips were pale, trembling, and when she tried to lift her head, her voice came out a weak whisper, almost lost to the wind. "Sir, can I borrow your coat?" For a moment, Eli stood frozen, not from the cold, but from the sound of that voice. Fragile, desperate, human. He couldn't remember the last time someone had asked him for kindness. Without a word, he shrugged off his heavy wool coat and draped it over her shoulders. She tried to thank him, but her teeth chattered too hard to form words. "You're half frozen," he muttered, kneeling beside her. Her skin was ice cold. He glanced around. There were no tracks leading away, no wagon, no horse. Just her, alone in the storm. "Can you stand?" he asked. She shook her head faintly. So he lifted her, she weighed almost nothing, and carried her back to Rust. Mounting up, he wrapped one arm around her and urged the horse forward. The ride back to the ranch felt endless. The snow stung his face. The wind screamed through the trees, and still she barely stirred in his arms. Once, she murmured something. The train, maybe, or running, but her words melted into the wind. By the time Eli reached his cabin, the fire had nearly gone out. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, startling Martha, who was darning socks by the hearth. "For heaven's sake, Eli," she gasped. "What?" "Found her by the creek," he said, already lowering the girl onto the rug near the fire. "Get blankets." Martha didn't argue. Together they stripped off the girl's soaked shoes and wrapped her in quilts. Her fingers were blue at the tips. Her pulse was weak but steady. Eli sat beside her long after Martha went to fetch hot broth. Outside, the storm roared like a living thing, but inside, the crackle of the fire filled the silence. He should have felt pity, and that's all. But as he watched her chest rise and fall, something else stirred inside him, something he hadn't felt since before the world turned cold. He told himself she'd leave when the snow melted. But even then, as he covered her with another blanket, Eli Grant knew that this night, and that trembling voice asking for his coat, would haunt him forever. Morning came slowly to the Grant ranch, the pale winter sun spilling weak light over snow-covered fields. Inside, the fire burned low and the scent of broth filled the air. Eli Grant hadn't slept. He sat in the wooden chair beside the hearth, eyes fixed on the young woman bundled beneath layers of quilts. Every few minutes she stirred, a twitch of her fingers, a shallow breath, and each time his heart gave a strange, unfamiliar pull. When Martha came down the stairs, she found him still there, coatless, his face drawn and tired. "You've been up all night, Eli," she scolded gently, setting a bowl of steaming porridge on the table. "You'll catch your death next." He didn't look up. "She was half buried in snow when I found her," he said quietly. "Wouldn't have lasted another hour." Martha sighed, glancing toward the stranger. "Pretty thing, but there's fear written all over her face, even in her sleep." Eli said nothing. He'd noticed it too, the way her brows furrowed as if she were trapped in some nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her lips moved once, a whisper he couldn't catch. Something like a name, or a prayer. It wasn't until midday that she opened her eyes. The sound of fire crackling must have roused her. She blinked, disoriented, before realizing she wasn't outside anymore. When her gaze found Eli's, she froze. "You're safe," he said gruffly, rising from his chair. "You're at my ranch. You were near the creek when I found you." For a long moment, she just stared at him, wary, like a cornered animal. Then her lips parted. I didn't mean to trouble you," she whispered, her voice raw from cold and sleep. I thought I could make it to the station before the storm." "The train?" he asked. She nodded faintly. "It was late. I got off to rest, but I didn't mean to fall asleep." Her words were scattered, unsure. Eli could tell there was more she wasn't saying. The way her eyes darted toward the door told him she was used to running. But he didn't press. "You're not going anywhere till you're warm and strong again," he said simply. When he brought her a cup of broth, she hesitated before taking it. Her fingers were slender but scraped raw, as though she'd been working hard or hiding long. After a few sips, her color returned slightly. "Do you have a name?" Martha asked gently from the kitchen. The girl's gaze flickered to Eli, then back to the fire. "Clara," she said after a pause, almost as if she were inventing it on the spot. "Clara," Martha repeated with a kind smile. "That's a fine name. You'll stay here till the road's clear. Eli won't mind." Eli grunted. Not exactly a yes, but not a no either. Over the next few days, Clara barely spoke. She moved softly around the cabin, helping Martha where she could, always keeping her distance from Eli. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she'd stand by the window and stare toward the horizon, her hands gripping the sill tight enough to turn her knuckles white. Eli watched her quietly. He saw the way she flinched when a door slammed, how she folded her hands whenever he raised his voice, even just to call the horse from the stable. She wasn't just lost. She was afraid. One evening, as he brought in firewood, he caught a glimpse of her wrists as her sleeve slipped back, faint bruises, yellowing but still visible. When she noticed him looking, she tugged the fabric down and turned away. "Clara," he said softly. "Who hurt you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered, "It doesn't matter." "I'm safe now." He wanted to ask more, to demand the truth. But something in her trembling voice stopped him. Instead, he nodded once and said, "You are. For as long as you're here, no one will touch you." That night, as the fire dimmed, he found himself thinking of her voice, of the way she had said safe like it was a word she hadn't believed in for a very long time. He told himself she was just a stranger, a burden he'd picked up out of decency. But when he looked at the empty chair across from him, he realized something dangerous. The house didn't feel quite so lonely anymore. The days passed quietly on the Grant Ranch. Outside, the snow began to soften under weak patches of sunlight, dripping from the eaves and turning the frozen fields into glassy rivers of thaw. Inside, the house that had once echoed with emptiness began to hum faintly with life again. Clara had found her rhythm, sweeping the floors, helping Martha in the kitchen, and humming soft tunes under her breath when she thought no one was listening. Eli Grant pretended not to notice, though he did. Every small sound she made seemed to pull him from the silence he'd wrapped himself in for years. It unsettled him. After all, the ranch had been quiet since the day his wife Lydia died. He had kept it that way on purpose. No laughter, no chatter, no reminders that life went on. But now there was this girl, this stranger with frightened eyes and a gentle touch, moving through his world as if she belonged there. Martha noticed, too. "She's good for this place," she said one morning while kneading dough. "And for you." Eli didn't respond, but his silence said enough. He didn't want to admit it, to her or to himself. Still, he couldn't ignore the small things. The way Clara flinched when a door creaked open, or how she jumped at the crack of thunder one evening. Once, while fixing the fence, Eli caught sight of her walking along the ridge, arms folded tight around herself. The wind tugged at her hair, and for a moment she looked so lost that his chest ached. He approached her quietly. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. She turned quickly, eyes wide with fear, before realizing it was him. I just needed air, she murmured, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine, but she wasn't fine. Her hands trembled, and when Eli looked closer, he saw faint bruises near her wrists, marks that hadn't been made by cold or work. He hesitated, not wanting to scare her further. Clara, he said softly, did someone hurt you? Her eyes darted away. It doesn't matter. I'm safe now. There was finality in her tone, a wall he couldn't climb. Eli didn't press her. He simply nodded and said, If anyone comes looking, you tell me first. Understand? She gave a small nod. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Eli sat near the window watching the snow fall under the moonlight. He remembered how Lydia used to sit in that same spot, humming lullabies while sewing clothes for the baby that never took its first breath. Losing her had broken something inside him, something he had never tried to fix. But now, for the first time in years, he found himself wondering if he still had something left to give. The next morning, Clara was already up, stirring the fire. When Eli walked in, she smiled shyly. You're always awake before the sun, she said softly. Old habits, he replied. She handed him a cup of coffee with trembling fingers. Thank you for letting me stay, she murmured. You didn't have to. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the exhaustion behind her eyes, the way her smile was something she had to force. Maybe I did, he said quietly, before turning away to hide the warmth creeping into his voice. As the days stretched into weeks, the air between them shifted. Clara laughed more, though softly, and Eli found himself listening for that sound whenever he returned from the fields. Still, she never spoke of her past, not the train, not the running, not the man whose shadow she seemed to fear. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she'd touch her wrist absent-mindedly or stare at the door as if expecting it to burst open. And though Eli said nothing, a quiet promise settled deep inside him. Whoever had put that fear in her eyes would never touch her again. For the first time since Lydia's passing, Eli Grant felt something more powerful than grief, the stirring of purpose, and the dangerous spark of hope. By late February, the snow had begun to recede into patches of mud and slush. The valley breathed again. The fences emerged from their white graves, and the cattle stirred restlessly in the barn. Life, in its slow, quiet rhythm, had returned to the Grant Ranch. For weeks, Clara had been helping Martha with the morning chores, her laughter beginning to sound less forced, her steps lighter. But beneath that fragile calm, there was still something, a shadow that followed her even when the sun was out. Eli noticed it most in the evenings. Whenever a rider passed down the far road, Clara would pause, her hands freezing mid-task. Her eyes would dart toward the window, her breath catching. He never said anything, but the tension in her shoulders told him enough. Then one afternoon, as Eli came back from town, Sheriff Tully stopped him outside the general store. You had a young lady up at your place, right? The sheriff asked, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of straw. Slim fella came through town earlier. Said he's looking for a runaway girl. Matches her description? Eli's grip on the reins tightened. What did you tell him? Nothing much. Just said I hadn't seen her. But he'll ask around. Man didn't look friendly. Eli gave a curt nod, jaw tightening. Appreciate it. Then he turned his horse home, his heart heavy with something that felt like dread. When he entered the house that evening, Clara was setting the table. The firelight touched her face, soft and warm. But as soon as she saw his expression, her smile faltered. What is it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli removed his hat and placed it on the hook. Someone came asking questions in town. A man. Said he's looking for you. Her face drained of color. The bowl in her hand slipped and shattered on the floor. Martha gasped, rushing to pick up the pieces, but Clara didn't move. Her lips trembled as she whispered, He's here. Eli frowned. Who is he? She shook her head violently. You don't understand. You can't tell him I'm here. He'll hurt you. Clara, Eli said firmly, stepping closer. Whoever he is, he's not coming near you. You're safe here. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't seem to believe him. Men like him don't stop, she said, her voice breaking. I thought I could get away this time. Eli felt something inside him harden, the same thing that once drove him to face down wild animals and debt collectors after Lydia's death. He wasn't about to let fear walk into his home again. When night fell, the ranch was unnaturally quiet. Even the wind had stilled as if waiting. Clara sat near the fire, her hands clenched in her lap, while Eli sat by the window, rifle across his knees. Every creak of the porch boards made her flinch. Around midnight, Rust whinnied outside, a nervous warning sound. Eli rose slowly and opened the door. A figure emerged from the dark, swaying slightly. "Evening, friend," the man called, his voice slick with arrogance and whiskey. "Heard you're harboring someone who don't belong here." Eli stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. The lamplight spilled over the stranger's face, sharp, mean eyes and a cruel smirk. "She's mine," the man said. "Ran off when she owed me. You hand her over, and I'll be on my way." Eli's reply was quiet but steady. "She's not yours," the man sneered. "That right? Maybe you want to make her your problem, old man?" Eli didn't blink. He cocked the rifle, the click echoing in the cold night. "You take one more step toward that door and you won't walk away." The stranger hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window where faint light glowed. Then, seeing something in Eli's gaze, something colder than the barrel pointed at him, he spat in the snow and turned back down the trail. When Eli re-entered the cabin, Clara was standing, trembling, tears streaking her cheeks. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk yourself for me?" Eli set the rifle down slowly. "Because," he said, his voice rough, "no one did that for the woman I loved." For a long time, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence between them. And in that fragile stillness something changed. The fear in her eyes softened, and the loneliness in his heart began, at last, to thaw. The morning after the stranger came, the ranch felt different, quieter, heavier, as if even the walls were holding their breath. The man was gone, but his shadow lingered. Clara barely spoke, her eyes darting to the window each time the wind rattled it. Eli Grant, though outwardly calm, hadn't slept a minute. He'd kept watch by the fire until dawn, rifle across his knees, every nerve alert. Martha tried to bring normalcy back, humming while she cooked breakfast, but Clara only picked at her food. When Eli entered, she straightened nervously. He gave a brief nod, then went to the window. The world outside was gray and still. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, covering the footprints from last night. "He won't be back," Eli said finally, more to himself than anyone else. Clara looked down. "You don't know him," she whispered. "He doesn't stop until he gets what he wants." Her words settled between them like ash. Later that afternoon, Eli saddled his horse and rode into town to speak with Sheriff Tully. The sheriff listened with a frown, scratching at his beard. "Name was Reed Harlan, far as I got from folks in town. Gambler, drifter, mean as they come. Claimed the girl owed him money." Eli's jaw tightened. "She owes that man nothing." "I believe you," Tully said. "But men like Harlan don't fight fair. You best keep your doors locked." "I will." Eli tipped his hat and rode back home, the snow falling harder now. By the time he reached the ranch, the light had faded. The air felt electric, thick with the promise of something coming. He found Clara standing on the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She looked like a ghost against the snow. "He's out there, isn't he?" she asked softly. Eli dismounted. "Maybe. But you're not alone anymore." That night the storm returned, fierce and wild, as if the mountains themselves were angry. The wind howled through the trees, and thunder rolled low in the distance. Inside, the fire burned high, but Clara couldn't stop trembling. She sat near the hearth, hands clasped tightly while Martha dozed upstairs. Eli sat across the room, cleaning his rifle in silence. Then a sound, the distant crunch of boots in snow. Eli's head snapped up. He knew that rhythm, steady, deliberate. Not the wind, not an animal. Someone was coming. He rose quietly, motioning for Clara to stay put. She obeyed, though her eyes widened in terror. The steps grew louder, closer, until a voice cut through the storm. "Grant!" The drawl was unmistakable. "Reed Harlan." "We've got unfinished business." Eli opened the door, the wind whipping through the room. Harlan stood a few yards away, a pistol hanging loose in his hand. His face was twisted with anger and whiskey. "Turn her over," Harlan spat. "Girl owes me a debt." Eli stepped out into the snow, the cold biting through his shirt. "The only debt here," he said evenly, "is the one you'll pay if you don't walk away." Harlan laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You think you can scare me with that rifle, old man?" "I don't have to scare you," Eli said. "Just stop you." The wind howled between them, and for a long moment neither moved. Then Harlan raised his gun, but Eli was faster. The rifle cracked once. The bullet hit the snow near Harlan's feet, close enough to spray white powder over his boots. "Next one won't miss," Eli warned. Harlan hesitated, eyes darting from Eli's steady aim to the cabin behind him. Whatever he saw there, the determination, the firelight, the unflinching line of Eli's jaw, was enough. With a curse, he turned and stumbled back into the darkness. Eli stayed outside until the footsteps faded completely, the storm swallowing them whole. Then he went back inside, shutting the door firmly behind him. Clara was standing there, tears streaming down her face. "You could have been killed," she whispered. Eli set the rifle aside, his voice low and rough. "Maybe, but I've already lost one woman I couldn't protect. I won't lose another." For a moment, the only sound was the fire's quiet crackle. Then Clara stepped forward and did something she'd never dared before. She reached out, resting her trembling hand against his chest. "You didn't just protect me," she said softly. "You gave me my life back." Eli's eyes softened. "Then keep it, Clara, and don't ever run again. Outside." The storm raged on, but inside, for the first time, warmth triumphed over fear. The storm passed by dawn, leaving behind a quiet world blanketed in silver. The snow on the hills sparkled under the pale sunlight, and the icicles dripping from the roof glistened like glass. The world looked new, clean, reborn, and for Eli Grant, something inside him felt the same. He had spent the night by the dying fire, not out of duty this time, but because he couldn't bring himself to leave Clara alone. She had fallen asleep in the armchair, wrapped in a quilt, her face soft for once, free of fear. Watching her breathe in the flicker of the firelight, Eli realized he'd made a silent vow that night, one he hadn't spoken aloud. He would never let harm touch her again. When morning came, Martha descended the stairs and found him still there, sitting quietly, a mug of cold coffee untouched beside him. "You're wearing that same look you used to wear when Lydia was around," she said gently, kneeling to stir the ashes back to life. Eli didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure he could. He'd spent 3 years living like the dead, haunted by guilt and silence. But Clara had changed the air in that house. Her laughter, faint though it was, had filled spaces that had long been hollow. Later that morning, Clara woke to the smell of coffee and bread baking. Her cheeks were still pale, but her eyes, those clear, storm-touched eyes, seemed brighter. "Did he really go?" she asked softly. Eli nodded. "He won't be back." She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers together. "You sound certain." "I am," he said simply. "And if he tries again, he'll find me waiting." Something flickered across her face, a mixture of relief and sorrow. "You shouldn't have to fight my battles," she whispered. Eli met her gaze, steady and sure. "Maybe it's not just your battle anymore." That day marked the beginning of a slow, quiet thaw, not just of the snow, but of hearts that had long been frozen. Clara began to hum again while she worked. She cooked meals with Martha, learned to feed the horses, and even managed to laugh when one of the chickens pecked at her skirt. The sound startled Eli at first. It had been so long since laughter filled his home. But soon, he found himself waiting for it, the same way he waited for sunrise. Martha, ever watchful, saw the change in both of them. "You've brought life back to this place, Clara," she told her one afternoon. "That man wouldn't say it, but I will." Clara smiled shyly, her hands dusted with flour. "I think maybe it's this house that brought life back to me." Still, the scars of fear didn't fade overnight. Some nights, Eli would wake to the sound of her crying softly, caught in dreams of the past she wouldn't speak of. He never intruded. He'd just sit by the fire waiting until she calmed again. Sometimes she'd join him there, sitting silently beside him until dawn painted the horizon pink. One evening, as the first green shoots began to push through the melting snow outside, Clara stood at the window watching the fields. "You said the land always comes back after the frost," she murmured. "I didn't believe it before." Eli turned from the table, his gaze following hers. "It does," he said quietly. "Takes time, but it always does." When she looked at him then, her eyes held something new, trust, maybe even affection. He felt it, warm and dangerous deep in his chest. He wanted to reach for her, to tell her that she'd brought color back to a life that had been gray for too long. But instead, he just nodded toward the window and said, "Looks like spring's finally here." And though neither of them said it aloud, both knew the truth. It wasn't just the land that was thawing. It was them. Spring had come in earnest to the valley. The last of the snow had melted from the fences, and the creek near the edge of the ranch finally sang again, alive with clear, cold water. The Grant Ranch looked like it was breathing after a long winter's sleep. Fences mended, cattle grazing, blossoms nodding along the fence line. Clara had changed too. She no longer walked like someone afraid of being seen. Her laughter came easier now, light and genuine, and she'd taken to leaving wildflowers in little jars on the windowsills. Every corner of that house, once a monument to silence and grief, now smelled faintly of bread, soap, and life. But beneath that peace was a quiet question neither she nor Eli Grant dared to voice. They moved around each other with a careful rhythm, close enough to feel the warmth, distant enough not to break it. Martha noticed, of course. "Two ghosts who won't admit they're alive again," she muttered one morning while polishing the kettle. Eli brushed off her teasing, but he couldn't deny that Clara had become part of his days. When he returned from the fields, he found himself listening for her voice, the sound of her soft humming in the kitchen, the way she smiled when she handed him his supper. It was a comfort he hadn't known he needed. And yet, Eli kept one part of himself locked away, both literally and in his heart. One rainy afternoon, while tidying his room, Clara found it. The drawer of his old desk was slightly ajar, and inside, among worn ledgers and letters, lay an envelope, yellowed, unsealed, and never sent. The handwriting on the front read, "To my wife, Lydia." Clara froze. She knew she shouldn't read it. But something in the way the paper was folded, as though it had been handled 1,000 times, drew her closer. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The words were raw and heavy with sorrow. "Lydia, if I could trade places with you, I would. I don't know how to live without you. The house is too quiet, the morning's too long. I can't forgive myself for what I couldn't save. I promised you I'd be a good man. But I've kept only one promise, to never love again." Clara pressed the letter to her chest, her throat tightening. She understood now why Eli had that distance in his eyes, why he carried a sadness deeper than the storm that had brought her to his door. When Eli entered the room moments later, the sight of her holding the letter hit him like a punch. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of rain against the window filled the silence. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, setting the letter down. "I shouldn't have—" He stopped her with a raised hand. "No, it's all right." His voice was low, roughened with emotion. "You weren't meant to find it. But maybe it's time someone did." Clara looked at him, eyes shining. "You loved her very much." "I still do," he said quietly. "But grief, it's like winter. You think it'll last forever, and maybe part of you wants it to." She stepped closer, her hands clasped together. "Maybe it's time," she whispered, "to stop keeping promises to ghosts." Her words struck something deep inside him. For years he had lived only in memory, punishing himself for surviving when Lydia hadn't. But now, standing before this woman, trembling yet unbroken, soft yet strong, he felt a warmth that frightened him more than any storm. He took the letter gently from her hands and folded it back into the drawer. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "You start by letting the living in." When she left the room, Eli sat for a long time, staring at that drawer. The letter had been a weight he carried every day, a promise carved in grief. But now, for the first time, he felt something shift, a sense that Lydia might not have wanted him to live alone forever. That night, as he sat by the fire, the rain still falling steady outside, Eli realized something both painful and freeing. The past didn't have to be forgotten. It only had to stop being the only thing that mattered. And in the faint sound of Clara humming in the kitchen, he heard not a reminder of loss, but the promise of life beginning again. The morning the letter drawer was finally shut for good, the valley seemed unusually quiet. The air carried that strange, bittersweet scent of spring rain and thawing earth, as if the land itself was trying to remember how to breathe again. Eli Grant had slept little that night. He'd sat by the fire long after Clara had gone to bed, watching the flames die down to embers. The words she had spoken, "You start by letting the living in," had echoed in his mind until the first light crept over the hills. He didn't know what that meant yet, not truly, but for the first time in years, the idea didn't scare him. Clara, too, woke before dawn. She moved about the kitchen quietly, her every step careful, her heart heavy with something she couldn't quite name. The letter she had found lingered in her mind, the weight of his grief, the tenderness of his guilt. And though he'd told her she'd done nothing wrong, she couldn't help but feel like an intruder in a life that still belonged to someone else. By mid-morning, the coach from the nearby town arrived, a rare thing this deep into the valley. It came rumbling up the long dirt road, scattering the hens and startling the horses. Martha spotted it first and frowned. "No one sends for a coach out here unless something's ending or something's beginning," she muttered under her breath. Eli was outside, fixing the gate, when he saw Clara step out onto the porch. Her hands were clasped tightly before her, her face pale but calm. Behind her, at her feet, sat a small carpet bag, the same one she'd arrived with that fateful snowy night. He froze, the hammer slipping slightly in his grasp. "You're leaving?" Clara hesitated, her eyes on the distant road rather than on him. "I got a letter," she said softly, "from a cousin in Fairview. She says they've room for me at her boarding house. She thought I might want to come." Eli's chest tightened, though he said nothing. He just nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Fairview's a long way off," he finally said. "I know." He set the hammer down, wiping his hands on a rag. "You don't owe me anything, Clara." Her lips trembled slightly. "I know that too." She took a small breath. "You gave me safety when I didn't deserve it. I won't forget that. But I can't stay here and make your house a shrine to what's gone." He winced at the truth in her words. "You think that's all this place is?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, and her eyes softened. "No, not anymore. But I think you need to find out what it can be without me standing in the doorway." The silence between them was thick, filled with all the words neither dared to say. Martha stood by the porch, pretending to fuss with her apron, but watching every breath between them. Finally, Eli stepped forward. "You'll be safe?" "I think so," she said, trying to smile. "Your coat kept me warm through the worst storm of my life. I think I can face the rest." He nodded again, slow and quiet. "Keep it." She shook her head. "It's yours." He took a long look at her, at the woman who had come to his door half frozen, and left him with a warmth he hadn't known he'd lost. Then he pressed the coat back into her arms gently. "Then let it be ours." Clara's breath caught. For a second it looked as though she might break, might cry or run to him, or finally say all the things she'd held back. But instead she turned toward the coach, her steps steady. Martha whispered something as she passed, a blessing perhaps, and then she was gone. Her small figure swallowed by the road and the rising mist. Eli stood there long after the wheels had faded from view, the empty sound of the valley settling around him. The ranch felt hollow again that day, quieter, but not the same kind of quiet it used to be. Not the dead kind. Because this time, Eli realized, silence didn't mean loss. It meant waiting. And though she had left, he knew somehow that this wasn't the end of their story, just the pause between two seasons. Summer came slow to the valley that year, almost shy after such a long, bitter winter. The meadows turned gold, the cattle grazed fat and calm, and the sky stretched wider than it had in months. But for Eli Grant, the passing of the seasons only deepened the quiet ache that had settled in his chest since Clara's departure. He worked harder than ever, mending fences, clearing brush, tending to calves, as if the rhythm of labor could still the thoughts that haunted him. At night, he'd sit on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold, staring down the same road she had disappeared along. He told himself she was safe, that she'd found the peace she deserved, but the truth was simpler and sharper. He missed her. Martha noticed, of course. "You're wearing that same face you wore the winter Lydia passed," she said one evening as she set a loaf of bread on the table. "Difference is, this time the woman's still alive." Eli didn't reply. He rarely did when the words hit close to home. Every now and then, letters arrived from Fairview. The handwriting was neat and careful, Clara's unmistakably. She wrote of small things, the boarding house where she worked, the garden she tended behind it, the children who ran past her window every morning. Never anything personal, never a word about missing him. But between every line, Eli could read the silence, the same longing he carried. He wrote back sparingly, his letters short, practical. He asked if she needed money, if she was safe, if she had enough to eat. She always said yes, though he suspected it wasn't always true. And though the letters grew fewer over time, they never stopped completely. One afternoon, late in July, a sudden storm swept down from the mountains, short, fierce, and unexpected. By the time it cleared, the sky had broken open into the deepest blue he'd seen all year. The air smelled of wet earth and clover. Eli stood on the porch, breathing it in, when he noticed something. A figure walking down the long road, a small shape against the setting sun. He thought at first it was a traveler passing through. But as the figure drew closer, his heart began to pound. The walk was familiar, slow, careful, slightly hesitant, like someone measuring each step. And then, as the wind shifted, he saw her. Clara. She was thinner than before, her hair longer, her dress travel-worn. But her eyes, those clear, trembling eyes that had once begged for warmth on a snow-bitten night, held the same quiet courage. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Words felt too small for the weight of everything that had passed between them. Finally, Eli stepped down from the porch. "You came back," Clara nodded, her voice soft but steady. "I tried to stay away. I told myself I could start over." She paused, swallowing hard. "But every morning when the wind blew, it smelled like pine and rain, and I thought of here. Of you." He didn't speak. He couldn't. "I kept the coat," she said, a small smile trembling at her lips. "Every time I put it on, it felt like coming home." Eli took a slow step closer. "You didn't have to come back for me." "I didn't," she whispered. "I came back for us." The air between them hummed with something alive, fragile, but real. The pain, the silence, the letters, all of it had led to this moment, standing in the soft gold light of a summer evening. Eli finally reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "You sure this is what you want?" Clara's eyes glistened, her answer barely above a breath. "I've never been sure of anything." He nodded once, then stepped aside, gesturing toward the porch. "Then come on in." "Supper's getting cold," she laughed, quiet, almost disbelieving, and followed him inside. That night, Martha sat by the fire, pretending not to smile as she watched the two of them move around each other like they had never truly been apart. Outside, the crickets sang, and the last light of summer burned low against the hills. The valley, at long last, had found its peace. Autumn drifted gently into the valley, soft as a sigh. The heat of summer faded into cool mornings and amber light, the fields turning gold one last time before the frost returned. But this time, the changing season didn't carry the same ache of loneliness for Eli Grant. The house no longer echoed with silence. Laughter lived there again. Clara had returned not as a guest, nor a stranger seeking shelter, but as part of the rhythm of the ranch, its heartbeat. The small habits of their days had woven together naturally, like the steady rise and fall of breath. She tended the garden at dawn. Eli worked the pastures, and every evening they met on the porch, sharing coffee as the sun sank behind the ridge. It wasn't a loud kind of love. It was something quieter, patient, enduring, born from understanding rather than promises. Neither spoke of the winter that had brought them together, but both carried its memory gently, like a scar that no longer hurt to touch. One evening, as a chill wind swept through the trees, Clara came inside carrying the same old coat, the one that had first saved her from the snow. Its seams were frayed now, the fabric thin from years of use, but she held it as carefully as ever. "I was mending it," she said softly when Eli looked up from the hearth. "Figured it deserved better than to hang forgotten." Eli smiled faintly. "That coat's seen more storms than most folks," she nodded, folding it over her arm. "It's more than cloth. It's a promise, a reminder of who we were that night." He set aside his work, watching her closely. "And who are we now?" Clara hesitated, then met his gaze with quiet certainty. "Two people who stopped running." For a long moment, the fire crackled between them. Eli's eyes softened, the same eyes that had once been hardened by grief, now holding warmth again. He rose from his chair, crossing the room until he stood before her. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think that coat was all I had left to offer. Just something to keep the cold off someone else." Clara's lips trembled into a smile. "You gave more than that. You gave me a home when I didn't have one. You gave me a reason to stay alive." Eli reached out, his rough hand brushing hers. "And you gave me back the sound of life in this house." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was full of understanding, forgiveness, and something new that had taken root between them. After a while, Clara hung the coat by the door. Not tucked away in a drawer, not folded for travel, but there, where it belonged. A symbol not of departure, but of return. The years that followed were kind to them. The ranch flourished. Martha, ever watchful and tender-hearted, grew old but content, often teasing that she'd known how it would end from the start. And though storms came and went, as they always did, they faced them side by side. When winter returned, Clara would stand at the window, watching the snow fall over the valley, remembering the night she had first stumbled to his door. Sometimes she would whisper, "Sir, can I borrow your coat?" Her voice soft, playful. And Eli, smiling now instead of solemn, would fetch it from its peg and drape it over her shoulders, replying, "You never have to ask." On the mantel above the hearth sat a small wooden frame, a faded photograph of two figures standing before the old house, hands nearly touching, both smiling as if surprised by the warmth between them. Beneath it, neatly folded, rested that same worn coat, its fabric still faintly smelling of pine and smoke. It was no longer a symbol of rescue, nor of loneliness, but of the night when mercy turned to love, and two broken hearts found their way home in the snow. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the ranch slept under a quilt of gold and silver light. The world moved on, as it always did. But for Eli and Clara, the story had come full circle. A story that began with a trembling girl in the snow and a quiet man who offered her his coat. And though years would pass, and time would change everything else, that one act of kindness, that single, silent gesture, would remain at the door forever.